Hi, this is Jonathan Trebilco at Holy Cross. Welcome to this special presentation on the Tabernacle. A few weeks ago, I had mentioned to Father Robert, who's been teaching through the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, that it's very, very hard to really comprehend what the author to the Hebrews letter is saying unless we have the schematic diagram of the tabernacle in our minds, because he keeps referring back to this ancient sanctuary and talking about its furniture as well as its overall layout and how Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of these things we read about in the Old Testament. So the best way to do it, I told him, was to have some pictures and be able to kind of show and see visually what the layout of the tabernacle was in ancient Israel. You'll see the subtitle of this is Paradigm of Worship, and that word paradigm is really key. We're talking about a blueprint, a schematic diagram, a pattern of worship. And the writer to the Hebrews wants us to see how Jesus Christ brings this whole Old Testament way of worshiping to its fulfillment. The tabernacle would later be replaced by a permanent building about 900 years before Christ with the Temple of Solomon. And then that temple, 500 years later, would be greatly enlarged and adorned by Herod the Great. And this is the temple complex as it stood in the time of Christ. And so the recipients of the letter to the Hebrews are seeing this particular temple and worshiping there. And the author to the Hebrews is explaining why Jesus is the fulfillment of this, and this is only a shadow and a sketch of what God is doing for us in Jesus Christ. The key in Hebrews is chapter 8, verse 5. Look what he says here. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch and a shadow of the heavenly one, just as Moses warned when he was about to erect the tent. For God said, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So we have this idea of an earthly pattern that is the shadow being cast by the original heavenly sanctuary. That is the place where God's presence is manifested to us. So what we're looking at again with the tabernacle, later with the temple, the building, the more permanent building that replaced the tabernacle, is a pattern of salvation, a pattern of how we approach God. So if it's a pattern, here's a very basic picture that just is like a diagram really to show you the basic layout of the ancient tabernacle. You had the outer court or perimeter. This marked off the holy place from everything else around it. They came from a place that was disordered and full of death and decay into a holy place, a place set apart, distinct, and separate into God's space. And so we have the entrance, and then on the left there, and then moving forward, we have the altar. We'll talk about these things in a moment. The altar, the laver, and then the actual sanctuary itself, the tent, divided into two rooms. So the tabernacle, later on, the temple, which became more ornate and complicated, but it still had this basic pattern and paradigm, this basic layout. The idea with the tabernacle was this idea of increasing levels of sanctity as you move here from left to right. You have, in fact, what are called lines of sanctity. So you come to the door of the tabernacle on the left there, and you've come from the outside world into God's space. You come to the altar, and this is where an offering, a sacrifice is made to enter into God's presence. The priests move further to the next line of sanctity, to the laver, and there they engage in what are called ritual ablutions. And that just means that it's a ritual washing. It's not to wash away germs, it's to purify yourself to enter into the tent. And then we go into increasing levels of sanctity as we enter the tent. Only priests are allowed in the holy place. And then the final line of sanctity is at the curtain between the two rooms, the line that is the veil that blocks the most holy place from the holy place. And only the high priest went in the most holy place. One of the things that the tabernacle is doing is it's giving you a kind of diagram of the history of Israel. The fundamental identity of Israel was that they were an Exodus people. They were rescued and delivered by God from slavery in Egypt and brought out and brought to himself, brought into his presence, and he dwelt among them. So you know the story of the Exodus. You know that it was ordered that a lamb be sacrificed that final couple of days before they escaped from Egypt. And you know the blood of the lamb was applied to the doors. And the angel of death, it says in the Exodus narrative, passed over the houses of Israel. That's why it's called the Passover. And so there was a sacrifice to effect redemption. And following that sacrifice of redemption, that slaying of the lamb, Israel passed through the waters. The Red Sea was divided, and they walked through the waters with Moses as they headed to the Promised Land. And they were brought to Mount Sinai, and there at Mount Sinai, the paradigm, the pattern of the temple, of the tabernacle was given to them, and there God dwelt among them, and he moved into the neighborhood, and his presence was with them. Well, that's what we see when we look at the tabernacle. The first thing we encounter is an altar, sacrifice. The next thing we encounter is a laver with water in it, and they pass through the waters, and then finally the tent itself, God dwells with his people. So the tabernacle is a recapitulation of the Exodus story, which is the identity of God's people, rescued from slavery and brought out to become the dwelling place of God. Here's a model of the tabernacle. And what the tabernacle had to do was it had to effect a kind of paradox. It had to emphasize distance, the awful, holy presence of God. And holy fundamentally means what is distinct and set apart and different. God is holy, holy, holy. And also we are finite creatures, but we're also sinful, fallen creatures. So there's distance between us and God. But the tabernacle also was teaching access, the way back into God's presence. And so it had to do both of these things. Let's just walk through the basic structure of the tabernacle then so we can understand something of what it's about. This would be the front gate where worshipers would come with their sacrifice in order to fulfill one of the rituals of the Mosaic law. As we move into the actual court itself, the first thing we encounter is the altar of burnt offering. This is where the sacrifices were burnt and offered to God. It's a large brazen altar with a grating. The next item that we encounter as we continue on would be the laver. And as I said before, this is where the ritual ablutions took place, where they washed themselves, the priests would wash themselves to cleanse themselves before they entered into the actual sanctuary itself. So after the altar and the laver, we come to the actual sanctuary, the holy tent of God's presence. The tent itself actually had 4 coverings on it, and it goes from the most ornate and beautiful underneath to the most plain on the exterior. So underneath we have this fine linen with depictions of cherubim. Cherubim are these angelic creatures that are close to God's throne. Remember, the Jewish people did not make an image of God. They didn't have an idol or a statue that said, this is the essence of God. Rather, the cherubim, these angelic creatures, were understood to be the guardians of God's throne, and wherever the cherubim are, it signals that God is close by. Then the next level was the pure white goat's hair, and then after that, the ram's skin dyed red, and then finally, possibly a badger skin, some type of plain skin. The Hebrew is a little unclear there, but we think it might be a badger skin. If we pull away the layers of the actual tent itself, what we see is underneath is this beautiful paneled gold structure that is 2 rooms. The front room is the holy place, and the back room is the most holy place. So again, we're moving from less holy to more holy, increasing levels of sanctity as we move into the most holy place. The holy place was the room where only priests entered. They entered on a daily basis, and they went in there to attend to 3 holy objects that were inside the holy place. If we took the lid off the tabernacle model, this is what we would see. When you walk in through those pillars at the bottom of the picture, you're going to see 3 pieces of furniture. On the right is going to be this table of burnt sacrifice right here. And then to the left, you would see the menorah. And then straight ahead of you, a small golden altar of incense. So here's an artist's view of what it might have looked like when you walked into the holy place. Again, to the right, a table with 12 loaves of bread on it. To the right. To the left, the lampstand or menorah with 7 bowls of oil. There's no candles in the Middle East, okay? They would all melt. It's bowls of oil that are being lit. And then straight ahead of you, this small golden altar of incense before the curtain or veil that separates the holy place from the most holy place. So on the right, in the holy place, you would see this table with 12 loaves of bread and pots of incense. And it's called the table of the bread of the presence. Now, in the ancient Hebrew language, there are not words for abstract concepts like presence. My presence is with you. And so it's called the face bread. It's the bread of God's face. If God's face is there, his presence is there. And the face bread was there to say, and it was bread that only the priests ate in the holy precincts of the tabernacle. The face bread was there to say, God's presence is the very food of the people of God. It's what feeds them. It's what nourishes them. It's what keeps them alive. It's what makes Israel, Israel, is God's presence dwells with them. On the left side, in the holy place, would be the menorah or lampstand with the 7 branches. And just look at this lampstand carefully, and you'll notice this is based on a analysis of the text itself in the book of Exodus in the Bible, that the menorah or lampstand was actually designed to be a stylized tree. It had branches with these knops and leaves. Okay, so it's a stylized tree in the holy place. Put a pin in that. We're going to say something about that again in just a moment. Then straight ahead of you in the holy place was a small square golden altar, the golden altar of incense. And that was right before you came to the large curtain that had purple and scarlet and blue on it. And there the priests would burn incense. And this represented the prayers, the adoration of God's people ascending up before God's throne. Here's an artist's rendition of what, just the basic idea of what it would have looked like in the holy place. Again, as you walk in, 3 pieces of furniture, table on the right, lampstand on the left, golden altar of incense straight in front of you with a large curtain dividing you, cutting you off from access to the most holy place. Let's pretend now we've gone around the back of this model of the tabernacle, and we're going to take down the wall. What would we see? Well, we'd see the high priest. Once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is around September on our calendar, the priest would pass through the veil, the curtain, and he would go before the Ark of the Covenant dressed only in his white linen, and he would perform the ceremonies there for the Day of Atonement. So the holy place, the most holy place, had only one article of furniture, and that was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was understood to be the dwelling place of God on earth. It's spoken of as God's footstool a lot in the Old Testament. For instance, here in Psalm 132, let us go into his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. So I like to call the Ark of the Covenant God's ottoman. And so it represented God's presence with his people. There was a dramatic moment in the history of Israel when, on top of Mount Sinai, Moses is praying. You remember the famous incident of the golden calf. Moses was on top of the mountain for 40 days. They didn't know if he was coming back. They were too scared of God, whose presence had been manifested on the mountain. And so they had Moses' brother Aaron produce for them a golden calf, and they danced around it and bowed down and said, "This is the thing that delivered us from Egypt." And they committed idolatry. And so, way up on the mountain, Moses goes up to pray for the people, and God says, "Oh, you mean your people? They're your people now, and have a nice time. You're taking them to the promised land yourself." And Moses does not say to God, "It's been real, God. Thank you. We got it from here." He says, "Oh, God, if you don't go with us, if your presence isn't with us, none of this makes any sense. Israel is Israel because God dwells among them." And the sign of that, the sacrament of that, the physical expression of that, the seal of that, if you will, was this piece of furniture, this chest covered in gold with the two cherubim. Again, the cherubim triggering the idea, signaling God is close, God is near, God is here. The Ark of the Covenant represented God's throne. It was the throne of God, and from there he ordered his people, and he brought them into right relationship with himself. It's an altar because every year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the most holy place, and he would bring the blood of the sacrifice, and he would sprinkle it on that lid on the top here. He would sprinkle it 7 times. It's also a table because there was a pot of manna inside, and the idea was that from this throne and altar, God is feeding his people. As I say, once a year, the high priest went in dressed only in his linen garments, without his fancy exterior vestments, and performed the ritual. There you see him with the bowl of blood, and he's sprinkling, with the incense pouring up, he's sprinkling the blood 7 times on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. Here's the thing about ancient temples, the Jewish temple, but really any temple of the ancient Near East, or really anywhere in the world. A temple tells you how the people think about reality, how they view their world, how they view the relationship between heaven and earth. And that's exactly the case with the tabernacle. Now, those of you in the class studying the Epistle to the Hebrews, you had been studying the book of Genesis before that. And in Genesis, you remember that God placed the man and the woman in this paradise, the Garden of Eden, and there they enjoyed unbroken fellowship with God. There was easy fellowship, there was communion between God and his people. And that was broken and ruptured by the fall. When they defied God and turned from him, they were exiled from Eden and exiled from the glory of God's presence. What we find when we look carefully at the tabernacle is that first room we've been looking at, the holy place with the menorah and the altar and the table, is a reconstitution of the Garden of Eden in a sense, okay? So, for instance, if you go back into the book of Genesis, what you'll find is it says specifically, it seems odd, but it says there was gold in that land. When you go into the holy place, you pass from the outer courtyard where the altar and the laver are brazen, and you pass from brass to gold, and you move into a place that's paneled with gold, where all the furniture is gold. In the Garden of Eden, God spread a table for his people and said, "Of all the trees you may freely eat." In the holy place, there's food for God's people in the form of bread. Of course, it's different than the food in Eden. This is now a bread that's teaching something about redemption, because what is bread? It's food that has been taken, grain has been taken and cut down violently and crushed in the mill and burned in the fire, and then it's risen to become this nourishing food for us. You had in the Garden of Eden the tree of life, and the cherubim sent Adam and Eve into exile and barred the way back to the tree of life because they had defied God and they had cut themselves off from God and his presence and were moving into exile and death. Well, when you walk into the holy place, what did I say a few minutes ago? The menorah or lampstand is designed to be a stylized tree. It's a symbol of the tree of life. And now on the curtains are cherubim. In the Garden of Eden, the cherubim are sending Adam and Eve into exile and barring their way to the tree of life. In the holy place, the cherubim are there welcoming the priests back into God's presence. And so you have communion with God restored. And the holy place is Eden resurrected and brought back. So here's the point. If you look at the schematic diagram of the tabernacle, you're looking at a microcosm. That word microcosm is little world. It's a model of what the world is. And so you have this outer courtyard, and you see that laver there. That laver is full of water, and in later years, after the tabernacle was built, after it was replaced by the Temple of Solomon, that laver was actually called in the Hebrew Yam, which is the Hebrew word for sea or ocean. This out here in the outer courtyard represented the outer world with the ocean. Then we have the holy place itself with the food and with the tree of life and with the incense, which is communion with God, the prayers of God's saints ascending up to heaven. The holy place represents the holy place of Eden, where humans walked with God. And then finally, heaven itself with God's footstool, with God's throne. So what are we looking at when we look at the tabernacle? We're looking at a place of convergence. We're looking at a merger or a reunion or a remarriage between heaven and earth, between God and his people. And that's, of course, the whole point. Now, the person who wrote the epistle to the Hebrews was trying to emphasize that as wonderful and glorious as this ancient sanctuary was, it was only a sketch and a shadow of the real thing. And the real thing is Jesus, who came down from heaven and became the sacrifice for sin and dwelt among us, God with us, and then returned into heaven as our great high priest. And so that's why he says in chapter 9, Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, whether it was the old tabernacle with its curtains and its movable structures, or whether it was the great temple built by the despot Herod the Great. Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. That's why Jesus is the fulfillment. That's why following Jesus and believing in Jesus and being united to Jesus is the real deal. Now, I've walked you through these pieces of furniture in the tabernacle. We have the brazen altar and the laver in the outside courtyard. We walk into the holy place and we have the table and the menorah or lampstand and then the golden altar of incense. And finally, in the most holy place, the Ark of the Covenant. What we find sprinkled throughout the New Testament is that every single one of these pieces of furniture is applied to Jesus Christ. Jesus is the fulfillment of these things. And it's often subtle because we miss it because we were not raised in this paradigm. We were not familiar with this paradigm as they were. But the authors to the New Testament are constantly putting in little notes that are signaling Jesus is the fulfillment and completion of every single one of these pieces of furniture. So the altar of burnt offering that stood in the tabernacle courtyard, for instance, well, over and over again, Jesus is called the atoning sacrifice for our sins that brings us back into God's presence. And not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. Or if we look at the next piece of furniture, the laver, we read that Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her in order to make her holy, to prepare her to enter into his presence by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. And many other passages where we're told that we are washed by the blood of the Lamb, cleansed of our sin and brought into God's presence. The table of the bread of the presence, the face bread in the holy place. Well, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. The menorah or lampstand, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. The golden altar of incense in the holy place. Paul says to the Ephesians, Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. He is referencing the golden altar of incense and the incense that had to be burned there every single day, morning and evening, in the holy place. The veil or curtain itself that blocked the way between the holy place and the most holy place. It says in the letter to the Hebrews that Christ has inaugurated a new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Well, what happened to his flesh on the cross? Well, it was ripped apart. It was torn asunder. It was violently ruptured at the cross. And what happened when Jesus died in the Gospel of Matthew? At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and a new and living way was inaugurated, and access was opened up into the presence of God because of what Jesus had done. What about the Ark of the Covenant itself? This one we miss because the words, as they're translated, kind of lose their specificity. Paul says in the letter to the Romans that God put forward Jesus Christ as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, and we receive this through faith. This phrase, sacrifice of atonement, is the Greek word hilasterion, and that was a word specifically used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament to refer to the lid on top of the mercy seat. It was called the propitiatory, or sometimes it's translated the mercy seat. And that's the lid on which the high priest sprinkled the blood of the covenant on the Day of Atonement 7 times. You shall put the cover, there's that word Paul applied to Jesus. You shall put the cover on the top of the ark. There I will meet with you. And from above the cover, from between the two cherubim, there I will meet with you. And now the author to the Hebrews is saying, there, where Jesus Christ is in heaven, Jesus Christ, who came and who was sacrificed and who rose again and who ascended into heaven, there with Jesus we meet with God and we're reconciled to God. But not just the furniture of the old tabernacle, but the very tabernacle itself is fulfilled by Jesus. The opening sentences of the gospel according to John say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. And that's such a boring word, lived or dwelt, as some translations have it, because it's missing what the Greek is saying, eskenosin, which in Greek literally means to pitch a tent or to set up a tabernacle. Jesus is God with us. In Jesus, God has moved into the neighborhood and lived among us. He is the tabernacle. So again, the author to the Hebrews says, the tabernacle and the temple of old was a sketch and a shadow of the heavenly reality where Jesus has gone and accomplished salvation for us. What the tabernacle was in symbol, Jesus Christ is in reality. It's in Jesus that we have a convergence of heaven and earth. It's in Jesus that we're reconciled to God. It's in Jesus and union with Jesus that we have reunion with God and fellowship with God once again. The old tabernacle was a tent sanctuary which existed for a nomadic people. And as I alluded to before, the tabernacle was replaced by a more permanent structure about 900 years before Christ with the building of Solomon's temple. which had the same basic layout, but now was a building. And that building was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The Babylonians, the great empire of the ancient Near East, had come after many rebellions in the southern kingdom of Judah, where they had tried to rebel and not pay the tribute tax to the Babylonians. And finally the Babylonians came and broke down the walls and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and took the people out of Jerusalem and emptied Judah of most of its cities and took them into exile. And now the Jews were dispersed all over the world. But when the Persians took over from the Babylonians, they allowed a number of Jews from the southern kingdom of Judah to go back. And so the temple was rebuilt. The foundation stone was laid in 536 BC. And 500 years later, Herod the Great came to restore and remodel what we now call the Second Temple, this building, this new temple that was rebuilt. And when Herod came, he remodeled the temple. This is just before and during the time of Christ, into this vast complex that was one of the wonders of the ancient world. They said to Jesus in John chapter 2, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. And you can see the outer structure of this temple, the whole actual precincts of the temple. It was the size of 26 football fields. Massive, massive temple complex. And they were remodeling and fixing it all the way up till about 70 AD when the Romans came and destroyed it. One day when the disciples were with Jesus at a feast in the temple, they heard that some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. And Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down." So Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed. In the letter to the Hebrews itself, it says that with Jesus, the new covenant has come. In speaking of a new covenant, he's made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear. That's why some people think Hebrews was written before 70 AD, because the author is saying, hey, this is about to disappear. And disappear it did. In AD 70, the Romans came after the great civil war and uprising against Rome in Palestine, and they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem and broke through, and they destroyed the temple. In 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus had prophesied the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Romans. In Rome to this day, at the Arch of Titus, Titus was the general and son of Vespasian, the Roman emperor of the time. He's the one that finished the destruction of Jerusalem, and you can see here how the menorah, the lampstand, is being carried away by the Romans into exile. And so the temple was destroyed. Now, when we look at this temple schematic diagram, this is the diagram of the temple as it was in Herod's time, in the time of Christ. This is the schematic diagram of how the temple looked when the letter to the Hebrews was being written and read. And so you have this basic idea, very much like the tabernacle, of moving from least holy to most holy as you move forward from this outer court to the sanctuary. Here's the outer court where the people stood, and this is where they stood and would worship every day during the daily morning and evening sacrifice or during feast days. And then you have this barrier here, and here you have a series of steps, and on these steps the vested men and boys choir, a Levitical choir of Levite men and boys, would chant the psalm of the day. And then you pass from there into the holy precincts of the actual temple itself with the altar and the sanctuary there. So here's a model of the temple in Jerusalem that's there right now. You can see again this outer court here where the people worshiped, then the steps leading up into the sanctuary where the altars are. Here's another view. You can see the outer court here again where the people worshiped. Here's the steps where the choir was, and then here's the sanctuary itself. So the outer court, the choir, the sanctuary. If you were in that outer court, if we descended down into it, this is what you would see. Looking forward, you would see these steps where the choir was, and then beyond that, you would see the holy sanctuary itself. So we have a place where the people gather to worship. We have a place where the choir ministers, and then we have the holy place where the altar stands. Well, doesn't that sound familiar? We have in our church the nave, passing through the porch of the narthex into the nave where the people gather to worship. Beyond the nave, we have a space called the choir, where the vested choir ministers and leads in worship. And beyond the choir, we have the altar, the holy place, where the Eucharist is consecrated and celebrated. And if we move forward and look more carefully at that altar, we're going to see some symbols that are pointing us back to something. On either side of our altar are angels, which remind us of the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, where the presence of God dwelt. Or look in our chapel, where we have the angels on either side of the cross, looking down where the Eucharist is to be consecrated and celebrated in remembrance of that. You see, the point is as the letter to the Hebrews says, we have a great high priest, and he's not ascended into a temple or into a tabernacle or into a tent, but into heaven itself, Jesus, the Son of God. So what's the punchline? What's the point? Well, the point is, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. We have a great high priest. He's passed into heaven itself for us, and we get to go with him. We approach God's throne. We do so with confidence. It's a throne of grace. It's where we receive mercy. It's where we meet with God. So the author to the Hebrews, at the very end of the letter, brings it to this massive, glorious conclusion. And he says to the people who were used to the old covenant and who were thinking about the tabernacle and Mount Sinai and the temple in Jerusalem, he says, look, you have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire. Okay, where have we come? You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And when we get to the heavenly Jerusalem, what do we see there? Well, it's crowded. There's innumerable angels in festal gathering. We've drawn near to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. We've drawn near to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of all the departed, the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Now, when the author said the sprinkled blood, everybody knew what he was talking about. It's the blood that the high priest sprinkled 7 times on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant on the Day of Atonement to bring Israel together with God in that shadow and that ritual, that sketch so long ago. Jesus is the real sprinkled blood, and his blood speaks better than the blood of Abel. Remember in the book of Genesis when Cain killed Abel? God says to Cain, your brother's blood cries from the ground to me, calling for vengeance. Well, Jesus' blood doesn't call for vengeance. It calls for mercy and reconciliation and cleansing of the sinner to bring us back into fellowship and union with God. Here's the point. Christian worship is ascent. Christian worship is going on a journey. Christian worship is in union with Jesus Christ, rising up into the heavenly space with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, and drawing near to God because our high priest has gone before us, and we're with him wherever he is. So we enter the heavenly sanctuary itself. That's why in the Book of Common Prayer, in the liturgy, and this goes back to the ancient world, every single ancient liturgy has this. It's called the Sursum Corda. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up unto the Lord. Let us give thanks unto the Lord our God. Listen, that's what worship is. Lift up your hearts, and we go on a journey, and we ascend into the presence of God because a new and living way has been made for us. And then we say, with the words of the angels themselves, Holy, holy, holy Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of your glory. Glory be to thee, O Lord, most high. We take the very words of the angels upon us because we're with the angels, because we're in the heavenly space. In our liturgy, there's this glorious phrase of invitation to the altar: draw near with faith. And that phrase, draw near, goes right back to the Old Testament and to the tabernacle and to the temple. And it's a technical phrase that means you're drawing closer and closer and are invited in to the inner precincts of the holy presence of God in the temple. And we rise from our seats. We lift up our hearts. We ascend into heaven. We join our high priest. We're united again with God. We have fellowship with him. We're invited to the table. And there is no barrier. There is no veil. There is no curtain. There is nothing but full access granted to us. And when we celebrate the Eucharist, we draw near with faith to feed upon Christ in our hearts by faith. So I hope this has helped you see the basic structure, the schematic diagram, the paradigm of salvation and of worship as it was laid before us in sketch and shadow in the Old Testament, in tabernacle and temple, and then as the Epistle to the Hebrews is trying to explain to us how it's fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who is our high priest and who is God with us.